And of course, he's given lip service to global warming since then, but I know pretty much from being a Putin follower that he doesn't believe in it. And I don't think the Chinese do either. And I think that knowing that food shortages are coming, that the normal food growing areas in the north are going to be less productive, let's say, that they are starting to build greenhouses and conserve water out in the deserts of Central Asia, where China and Russia own a lot of territory in a more southerly area in Asia, below Siberia, below some of these northern areas. Are they now sucking in that fertilizer because they realize they have to make the desert bloom to survive?
Friends, you can see the supply chain disintegrating across the planet. And one of these things that's going to fail along with that will be the food supply chain. Do you have enough emergency food? Most people don't, and they'll panic when the time comes. And give yourself the peace of mind knowing that you have storable foods. 20+ year shelf life allows you to make wise choices, be able to stay home, avoid the chaos. So head on over to foodwithadap2030.com and see what else My Patriot Supply has to keep your family's grand solar minimum prepared. And now on with the video.
So this is Jeff Nyquist, and with me is David Dubine. Hi, David. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah, doing well. It's good that we're having a second chance to talk on what originally we had both talked about politically, temperatures, weather patterns, food price rises, and it all seems to be hitting exactly what we talked about in the prior interview.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about because the weather is really showing colder all across the globe. We've got it from Australia, New Zealand, all the way up to Northern Europe now getting hit, Russia, Antarctica having record low temperatures. So we can go over that. And fertilizer shortage, people saying the global food production is going to be down. Real problems in China, problems with, we had the drought in the Western U.S. with food there. And of course, we've got the things going on with the pandemic and people concerned
and the BC,
about
the floods.
The floods in BC, that's right. I had even missed that, and you were following that. And of course, we had another summer of flooding in China. So yeah, we have a lot to talk about. And maybe I'll just introduce this for the listeners. David, you have been writing and doing videos about global climate change, the incorrect kind, global cooling, and the grand solar minimum, which, what would you say, began like a year ago in June?
Well, I think there were some, indicators in 2015, 16, and 17, knowing about solar cycle 25 and 26, how they were going to onset, how quickly it would ramp up or not. And see, that's the whole thing about this solar cycle 25. It was supposed to start off like a screaming hot dog and then scalded dog running to the moon there, and it didn't. It kind of really stayed low coming out of solar cycle 24 into the minimum. And then, as it tried to get more sunspots, more magnetic activity, it's been sputtering. Although the last few weeks with the X flares and all these CMEs that we've seen, it's starting to turn on again, but it was far past the normal amount of time. And the way it's looking, it's not going to get anywhere close to the 120 or 110 or even 100 sunspot average they're talking about. It's going to be closer to probably 75 to 55, somewhere in that range. Huge miss on that part as well coming in, but we'll see. It's not, the solar cycle's not finished yet. We're not even at the solar maximum.
Right. Let's just review for those who are just introduced to this topic. We're talking about the solar cycle and larger cycles. Every about 11 years, the sun's electromagnetic field collapses, reverses and recharges, and that is just the regular solar cycle. And then there's a grand cycle, a grand solar minimum, that is the solar minimum, in which when that happens, the sun's electromagnetic field really doesn't fully reignite. And that electromagnetic field is really important because the sun's electromagnetic field protects the Earth from cosmic rays that strike the oceans, creating clouds, which means more rain, but also A cloudy day is cooler than a sunny day, creating global cooling. Have I got it right?
Yeah, and you forgot also that intense magnetic field is what locks the jet streams and the cloud cells into position. And if you have a wavering of what locks that in place, jet streams will go out of flow. So will the cloud cells will bunch up on themselves. You got the new cloud layer forming around 18 to 20,000 feet with all the cosmic rays. So now you have three factors colliding in instead of two. Cloud cells are moving to different areas, they're bunching up. Then the jet stream's bunching up on top of that, and you have a whole new cloud layer because of the cosmic rays.
Right. And so you end up with, and now let me just explain for those that don't know, the jet stream, you got these prevailing winds that go from west to east as the earth turns, in this certain direction. The earth turns, the sun sets in the west. And when you have a strong electromagnetic field in the sun, the jet stream just goes from this west to east direction. But then when that electromagnetic field collapses, they get all jiggly. So suddenly you can get really cold Arctic air pulled way down from the north, drawing very, very cold air far, far down, causing freezes and, catastrophic weather on crops. And you can get the other way around where warm air comes up unseasonably from below. And this also can, as you say, lock in clouds, causing droughts and massive flooding in some areas, which is what we've begun to see.
It seems that a lot of those patterns are locking in place too. There's not as much movement in sun. Okay, so when you're thinking about the movement within the different layers of the atmosphere, if you're going to get a high pressure cell or a low pressure that gets locked in and almost encircled by other patterns, it's going to lock itself in there, and then things are going to bend around it like a rock in a stream. But they're sort of symbiotic in the way that the pressure pattern will get locked in is because it's almost completely surrounded by all what we're talking in these other jet streams and cloud cells and the different trajectory of where that should move, but it can. It's almost encircling, so it's locking everything on. And then you got to think, is it a magnetic field line termination point that these things might energize themselves over? Because we see in the Volga region of Russia that it seems currently, and I'm just saying currently, that the crop production in the oat areas there are being, well, let's say, interfered with by regional shifts in the weather because there's a stronger electromagnetic or stronger charge coming out along the electromagnetic field lines, or the magnetic field line terminating out above the mesosphere heading back to the sun. Now it's like a light bulb. You've seen those real nice light bulbs in coffee shops where you can turn them up and you put more electricity into it and it glows brighter because there's more vibration in the electrons. Turn it down and it dims a little bit, less vibration, less of a medium moving through. So if you're thinking about the way electricity might move from the earth out to and back to the sun out through our atmosphere, what would that do? If it got more highly charged, it would have an excitation, I guess is the best way to put it, and then cloud cells and clouds in general, weather patterns would behave differently in regional areas, because if there's more of a charge in there, it's going to mean more heating, more evaporation, and things are going to bend around that too.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if you can pick out the magnetic field lines right now where you see these obscure weather patterns keep bending around the same exact areas. So now we can really start to get into the electrics or the electrogravitics, magnetism, and all these things you're talking about, the sun stepping down in its state of output, and then how the earth is responding to having less of that output electrically.
Since 2020, when this sort of was really starting up, we've seen now 2 summers in a row of massive flooding in China. I think they had record flooding this past summer again, which of course wiped out all of the rice growing seasons in whole provinces of China. They're not growing enough food even to feed half the population of China in China. So China has to find that food on the world market. And then you had flooding in Germany this summer, some in parts of France. You've had a drought in the western United States, which really killed a lot of grain production in the United States and corn production. So that's down. In fact, I understand some of the companies that were exporting large amounts of grain to China, they just didn't have much. and China can't pick it up in Europe. And I believe the Russian numbers are down. And weren't you telling me, David, that the crop numbers for the United States for this year, the harvest, is even less than was projected by the FDA?
The USDA.
I mean the USDA, right?
Yeah, that's it. So let me step you back to the Volga
Yeah.
region in Russia. What are you hearing about that? Because you know, for your expertise of what you understand about Russia and Russian politics, Central Asia, being connected back to Russia, what are you hearing about the Volga region? Because that's exactly where one of these electromagnetic field lines coming out, literally those lines that you see in the diagrams coming off that spin off the magnetic field lines of the Earth. There's a charge coming out of one of those, sending charge out from the Earth back into space that seems to be becoming more highly charged. And there's so many events around the Czech Republic extending over to that Volga region. And then you look at the crops that are grown under there, the oats and the barley, and they're having massive losses in those places. And then you look at the entire amount of production for Russia of the Volga region, what, 40%? And then you say, wow, if they're going to lose periphery regions plus that region itself and diminished yields, then how much really is going to come out of that area for oats and barley? But you say, oh, it's oats and barley, the wheat, okay, but others don't. So, you know, there's going to be a push and pull of the grains. So what are you hearing on the Volga region? Any kind of news coming out of there?
Well, they had early cold weather, unusually, and of course, North America, we didn't see that, but they saw that in Russia. They had some very cold temperatures suddenly striking in the fall. You probably saw that Beijing even got dusted with snow in October.
And they had a blizzard, the earliest blizzard and the highest snowfall ever recorded in November. And you know, how long did Chinese records go back? Their dusting was followed by a blizzard of multiple feet of snow just a week after that.
Yeah, and we're talking October, you know. I mean I'm above the 45th parallel hill. They're below that, and we didn't have snow here until November, until just about the middle of November here in the northern upper Midwest. So there is, and of course I talked to a fellow from New Zealand yesterday, talking about the unusual. Now it's their spring, and they're getting unusual cold in Australia. They've had unusual cold in Australia over their winter, and they're having it in New Zealand, and it's quite unusual. They're having also some more rainfall. Now this is consistent with the grand solar minimum, is that there's more clouds, so there's more rains, and more rains in the spring. And Australia has been really hit with unusual rains. Australia is a very dry continent, mostly. For Australia to get rains, it's quite unusual.
Yeah, for this period of history.
Right. For this.
But if you go back in and you trace that out, there's been some incredible research synthesizing, I think it was almost 750,000 different data sets across the planet in terms of what you're talking about, rainfall. All they did was measure rainfall patterns from, there's many ways to do this now. So for those of you who say, well, David and Jeff, they're just talking whatever about this rainfall. Well, you can prove it by going and looking, and there's 5 or 6 different ways that are truly the methods that they look at the amount of rainfall increases or decreases. Then they can map that out by drilling into, say, a high alpine lake. They'll drill down and they'll find all these different layers of deposited sediment. So if you're going to have a huge, gigantic, once in a 1,000-year flood, it's going to bring pebbles and big things like this in on a layer. But if it's just an average rainfall with an average year, you're going to get a bunch of silt and clay.
Yeah.
And going down over the centuries, you can start to measure that out and see exactly how much runoff there was. And then you can look at the stalactites coming out of the caves. You know, where we're used to icicles, they build fast because it's frozen water in winter, but the cave will do the same thing over thousands of years or hundreds of years, growing year by year. Stalactites, they just slice those open, and the same thing. The more rainfall it is, the thicker the accumulation for that 1 year, kind of like a tree ring, which is another one. More,
so
thicker tree ring, higher temperatures, more water.
So they can tell the rainfall from year to year and go back and check.
Oh, you can go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, but you have to have the physical substance to be able to check. Mm-hmm. So if the lake only goes so deep before it hits bedrock, that's your termination point. You can't go past that. Or if the stalactite coming out in a cave is only 20,000 years old, that's your limitation point there. You can't guess after.
Stalagmite. you pointed this really good site out, electroverse.net, and I encourage people to go there, and I think you
Yeah, follow
recommended
on.
just to read a couple headlines, and you can comment as I go down here. The first one is the global average temperature dropped 0.29 centigrade last month, now sits at just 0.08 centigrade above the 30-year baseline. So tell me what that means.
Well, the IPCC has been talking about limiting, and here, let's go back a little bit. Let's do a historical, since I was a kid, talking about global warming, now
Sure.
climate change, now climate extremes, rebranded many times.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a little bit older in a generation and you're not 15 years old or 20 years old, you will have only heard one thing of limiting to 1.5 C rise in temperatures. But when I was a kid, it was limiting to 2.0 C rise in temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
And we were told again and again that sea ice was melting in 2009. There will be no sea ice. The polar bears, there are going to be none. But that was in 2009. Those predictions were made earlier, 2003, 4. So when it came out and there was massive ice in 2009, they just kicked the goalpost. 2013, there'll be no more. 2018, 2000.
And by the way, right now, as you know, there's dozens of ships trapped in the Barents Sea in the sea ice. They're trapped, and even the icebreakers are having trouble getting to them.
Oh, I didn't know that, because I know there's sent several icebreakers out as a rescue mission to get those ships trapped in ice this early, unexpected, fastest growing. It's almost like, I wouldn't say a day after tomorrow event, but the way that it wasn't totally ice, it was sort of what you consider slush ice in the ocean floshing around, but then something hit it and it turned into ice instantly.
Right.
Across that entire region and froze all those ships in all at the same time. So rescuing one ship's one thing, but hey, there's 20 ships, Mayday, Pan, we're stuck in ice.
Yeah, and I think the number's above 30 the last I checked that are stuck out there.
Go get them all with 2 icebreakers.
Yeah, when you read, I was always big on the Arctic explorers. So what happened, the famous expedition of Sir Ernest Shackleton, their ship went down. They were going to go to the South Pole, and they were going through that slushy stuff, and all of a sudden it hardened up and the ship was trapped. And then it got harder and thicker until it crushed the hull of the ship. And then they were stuck on the ice, right? And they didn't have a ship. And they were kind of like, Robinson Crusoe. They were living on penguins and stuff, anything they could catch out there for almost 2 years, I think, before they got to be rescued. But
can I ask a question, Jeff?
Yeah.
What was the what era was that? Do you remember? I know the story, but I can't remember the year.
Before they came in, right after, you remember, I think it was 1911, 1912. The Scott and Amundsen were racing for the pole. And Scott was the British captain, naval captain, who was taking a British expedition, and they were trying to reach the South Pole. He used Shetland ponies and not dogs. And then Amundsen, the famous Arctic explorer, came down on the other side of Antarctica with dogs. And his trick was to eat the dogs on the way back, because the dogs would pull their supplies, but they need less supplies and it was fresh meat, so they wouldn't get scurvy. So Amundsen, and of course everybody said he was cruel to animals, and he beat Scott to the pole. But Scott famously, his polar party died on the way back. They died of scurvy, actually, they believe now. And so you had
lemons, not dogs.
What's that?
Limes, not dogs. Limeys. That's how the whole.
Limey,
right?
Brought
the limes with them on the ship so they wouldn't get scurvy, vitamin C deficiencies. Eat the limes. Look for the trail of limes. Oh, the British are here.
Yeah. The Norwegian Amundsen beat him to the pole and got back alive, but his party did not. Well, of course, they didn't have dogs because their Shetland ponies died early. The men were pulling their sleds. So imagine, the men were pulling their own supplies, their sleds. It's a tragic story, the polar expedition, but Shackleton had led an attempt to reach the South Pole earlier that failed, that Scott was on. They didn't make it. They turned back to save the men. But Shackleton went down there after, I think it was 1913, but I'm not remembering. It was before World War I, because they got stuck there. The beginning of World War I started when they were stuck on the ice. And that was when Shackleton's expedition was. So getting stuck on that ice, you cannot predict. This weather can be unpredictable. If that cold comes in, if those ice flows come in and it solidifies, this is how a ship gets trapped. And this is what's happening with the Arctic now. And of course, the Russians knew it, because in the last decade, the Russians had commissioned the building of an unprecedented number of new icebreakers, and they have nuclear icebreakers with nuclear engines. And if the Russians didn't believe that the ice was coming back, why would they be building icebreakers? The ice was going to go away.
Yeah, two things on that. The nuclear powered icebreaker, if it were going to run upriver and there were towns out of power, could it just dock up and they could plug into it and have power for a town at the same time that they're clearing ice going up and down? Just a random question.
It might.
That's the way my mind thinks, though.
I mean, any nuclear power plant, if it has those inputs, could probably be used to plug in and generate power off ship if they had the equipment, the cords and stuff. It's possible. And in fact, they might even be able to use it to bring heat onto another ship. An icebreaker can be kind of like a rescue ship. But I don't really know. I think the nuclear engine is part of how the icebreaker works, to generate the heat needed to help melt the ice in front of the ship, so the icebreaker itself doesn't get stuck. But I've never really studied the actual design of the Russian icebreakers. I know that they're pretty sophisticated, and they're building up their fleet of icebreakers. And as you know, Russia has the longest Arctic coastline, with many ports up there, and they're not all ice-free all the time. In this last 30 years of more warming weather, many of them, there's been unprecedented. That northern passage through the Arctic Sea, through the coast of the former Soviet Union, of Russia and Siberia, that has been free at times for ships to go all the way through to the Pacific. But generally, I mean, there was a discussion, the Russians' main fleet, their biggest military fleet, is out of Murmansk, which is right at the top of the Kola Peninsula. It's right near where Finland and Norway and Russia kind of come together up there. And that warm current that comes through the Atlantic comes up there and warms that. So it's ice-free most of the time. That port of Murmansk is generally ice-free. And that's where they base their Navy. And they were talking a couple of years ago about, could they bring their Navy across the Arctic to the Bering Strait to Alaska to help out China in a military emergency? And of course, that was being discussed in their military press. And it's the idea of moving an entire military fleet through that area. But of course, there's the danger that your fleet gets stuck, and that's a fleet has to move. If it's fighting, if it's stuck in the ice, it could be destroyed. And so they were talking about, having icebreakers for that purpose as well. And having the Arctic ice coming back. Now, is it your understanding, David, that the last couple of years, the ice in the Arctic has been getting larger during the winters, has it been expanding, the Arctic ice?
Well, I can't remember off the exact top of my head, but anybody who wants to do the research to verify what we're talking about can go to NSIDC. That's a National Snow Ice Data Center. And they have to within a couple hundred square kilometers or even more, tuned in than that, how much it is at the low melt point and what day it terminated at the melt point and started to regain ice through the last 30 years. So you can start to look at it yourself. But yes, as a general, over the last 3 years, it started to rebound on the ice, which makes me wonder. I wanted to go back to the icebreaker point for a second here. But this is the way my mind's working. Mm-hmm. All right, a nuclear powered vessel has a power plant on it. So right. If you're clearing the river at the same time and you knew there were 7 towns that you needed to go up to, could you put them on rolling brownouts or blackouts, knowing that in 7 days the ship's going to return and plug in and they can recharge everything, or they can have power for a full, say, 12, 15, 18 hours until that ship continues to the next destination upriver? In an emergency situation, you would know, and that would give you so much hope that you would have electricity full for one full day once a week versus being permanently out of power? Like, how would that change your mind frame? And are they thinking the same way? All right, maybe there's 2 icebreakers that follow, and every third day you get full power to be able, and how many, you said an absurd amount of icebreakers, and how many could be retooled to do the same thing on smaller fleets to go up the rivers, because there's an enormous amount of large cities on the rivers in Russia. So what if it were to be, a new way to power and keep trade open at that time? And then the icebreakers, when they're not in service or being repaired, they could just sit at a destination more remotely and power the thing all through the summer.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example now.
Or is that too outlandish to think like that?
Well, let's talk about the newest, fanciest Russian icebreaker. It's called the Arktika, Arktika, and you can look it up online. And it's their newest nuclear-powered icebreaker in decades. And of course Russia has the largest fleet of icebreaking ships in the world. It makes sense. They have the largest Arctic coastline, and it's capable of smashing through ice that's nearly 10 feet thick. Imagine that. 10 feet thick of ice. Millions of Russians live above the Arctic Circle. They've got the largest population above the Arctic Circle of anybody. That's huge. I mean, in Scandinavia, there's not even that many people. In Alaska and northern Canada, there's even less people living above the Arctic Circle. So Russia has this very large population, and they depend a lot of times, as you say, there's rivers in Siberia, and there's also the sea. And so this is from Popular Mechanics. The icebreaker itself, it's blue. Okay, let's see if they give the tonnage. It's got a 300-ton electric motors connected to the nuclear power. Wow, 300-ton electric motors. You can imagine smashing through 10 feet of ice. And yes, it looks like it's on a river here in one of the pictures. And it's 560 feet long, 112 feet wide, and it's 33,000 tons in the water. It's got a low length to beam ratio, a very high superstructure, making for it's a stout-looking ship. It is, and it's got an RITM 200 nuclear reactor it does 175 megawatts of power. That gives you an idea of what this thing can do. And by comparison, the USS Gerald Ford, which is an aircraft carrier, that's our newest aircraft carrier, displaces 100,000 tons, which is 3 times the size, and is powered by a generator that does 100 megawatts. So this thing does almost twice as much as the USS Gerald Ford in its engine that it generates. Isn't that interesting? So this nuclear-powered icebreaker, though it's the tonnage of an aircraft carrier, I mean, it just doesn't look as long, but it's pretty wide. But it's got to be a very heavy ship underneath. 175 megawatts. That's incredible.
See, in my mind, that's an overbuild to provide extra power offshore,
right,
if it docks off somewhere versus what the needs are on the ship itself.
Now they tell you how it works here. It does its job by bearing down on the ice using strongholds to crack the ice from above. It can smash through, like we said, 10 feet of hull ice. It's got a reinforced double steel hull. It's fascinating. So this gives you an idea of what they do, and of course this article depicts it as they're exploiting the warming Arctic, right? They have to put that in there, but it's really not. That's kind of hiding the fact. Right?
The narrative comes in many forms, doesn't it?
It does. You can say, oh, we're building more icebreakers because now we have access to more. No, you see, it's getting colder because it's getting warmer. That's what they've got. And of course,
now getting more carbon taxes.
Gosh, I mean, looking at the picture, depending on, they've got there's a number of, I think the ship was built in St. Petersburg shipyards. And then they have, how many nuclear powered icebreakers have been built in Russia? They've got 10 civilian ones built, and one is a container ship with an ice-breaking bow. 6 nuclear powered of the Arktika class. So there's 6 of these Arktika class ones. built in the Baltic shipyard in St. Petersburg. My goodness.
That's a lot of
So
movable power, isn't it? If you're starting to think that direction of knowing where this grand solar minimum is going to take us with supply lines getting cut off on a natural fashion, because when the second magnetic field starts to really pound the Earth here in 2023, we should see some significant effects as that field really starts to lock in Q2 of 2022 coming up next year. And as that does, we're going to get a lot of things on the surface of the earth cracks, sinkholes, slippage, uplift, these types of things that are going to damage the infrastructure that's riding on top of that very thin veneer of the very top of the crust here, called the top few feet of the earth that we walk on, is going to get disrupted down to about, I would say the top 2 miles of the crust would have a lot of effects. So if you already know that fiber optic cables will get pulled enough where they would snap, and electric lines, I know there's some elasticity built into that, but if you're going to think about something moving half a mile or a quarter mile, snap, okay, they're already pre-planning in that they're going to need to have movable power everywhere to still have some semblance of society, knowing that what we consider traditional infrastructure might have to shift drastically in the way you deliver power or goods to cities. If the above ground conduits aren't working, what's your plan B and then plan C?
now Russia has a lot of other non-nuclear icebreakers, but looking here on this thing, it looks like they have 11 nuclear ones right now. And these Arctica, these new ones, there's 6 of the 11. So they've basically doubled their icebreaker fleet in recent years. Interesting. So it's yeah, and then they give all their names: the Lenin, the Arctica, the Sibir, the Rossiya, the Semverpa. They've got all the names here, and they're saying what their status is. But it's very, it's something that we don't really hear a lot about. And of course, going back to the Electroverse, let's go on to this next one.
Can I ask you one question before we go?
Sure.
The names of all those ships, which one for you, knowing Russian culture, strategy, etc., which one of those names was the most interesting or jumped out from you? The Lenin, or was it
the Lenin?
The Lenin, okay.
Yeah, the Lenin, that's pretty interesting. Of course, the Lenin, that is an old one, and it's a museum ship now. So the Lenin is actually a museum ship. But of course, because they don't want to give those names now to
slowly
the
tugs
new ones.
along to bring power to places. It'll get there soon.
Yeah, they'll be there soon. But and now going back to Electroverse, this is really kind of illustrates record cold grip Siberia, minus 68.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Northern hemisphere snow mass marches on. Canada sees lowest November temperature since 2004. So any commentary on negative 68.3 degrees in Siberia? This is December 2nd here, 2021.
Right, and those are degrees below zero.
Below zero
67
Fahrenheit.
degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Because a lot of times, the way that the mind works, you have to put that below 0 to get it to really register. Whoa.
And those who like the Arctic explorers, if you read about Admiral Byrd spending the winter in the South Pole, if you read about these other expeditions, minus 40, minus 50, these are killer temperatures, right? Minus 68, imagine. That is so cold that if you expose your skin to it for more than a couple minutes, your skin will literally freeze. I mean, it is that is unbelievably cold.
Yeah, you had flash frozen food temperatures are what? Above that, 100 Celsius below 0 for the flash, or for the, what you consider, how do you freeze food that you would buy somewhere that's in a bag provided for you? They froze that. Flash freezing is that around that temperature for what you consider vegetables and things you would buy from Bird's Eye. I'm not promoting, I'm just saying, I'm just remember the name.
If you, for example, at negative 40, which is what the German army experienced in World War II in the Moscow campaign, at minus 40, if you do not protect, if you expose your eyes, this part of your head too long, your eyelids will freeze. And then you lose your eyesight because you can't close your eyes. And they had lots of German soldiers go blind because their eyelids froze. That's what negative 40 will do if you can't get some kind of protection. Wear goggles, have something that keeps the heat in somehow.
Yeah, go 25 degrees colder than that.
Right, 25 degrees colder. Just imagine. I mean, they had people. I mean, it was very famous. They issued the German army was not adequately. They did not have adequate cold weather gear in 1941 in December. So December 5th, the temperatures just dropped all of a sudden to this. This Arctic cold front just came in out of nowhere, and you could freeze to death defecating. Men literally trying to go to the bathroom would freeze to death before they could finish going to the bathroom. That's how cold minus 40, minus 68. Imagine that. You better be wearing a diaper. Maybe a spacesuit.
Yeah, I want to come back. In fact, the thing about the food in the cold too. When Shackleton was stuck in the ice and they was finally rescued, and the crew was finally rescued, whoever survived through that. The account is that when they finally got him back to an open water port, when they first came in, they all jumped out of the boats and started clubbing all the elephant seals that were just the random ones that were laying there and used to the people, but they were so hungry. And so, meals came by so infrequently, and they called them madmen at the end of it because they just ran around and clubbed 20, 30 elephant seals right on the beach there to get it because they were so used to jumping on whatever they could. So there's food on the boat, go get the food. There's food, go faster.
You just imagine you're living on the ice. You're trying to find penguins to eat. You are living on an ice floe basically, and your greatest moment of hunting was you found what was it, a snow leopard or whatever that they shot. It's one of these giant, it's related to a seal. And that's what you're eating. And they even had killer whales coming up underneath their encampment, breaking up into their encampment, trying to find them for food, But there's a book called The Incredible Journey of Sir Ernest Shackleton, which I recommend. I mean, I read it as a kid twice. I liked it so much. But it was truly an incredible journey. But how they got rescued is they had a longboat from the ship, and they decided to dare the weather, and they tried to sail that longboat from the Antarctic Sea area up to South Georgia Island, a whaling station. And they almost didn't make it, but this party made it and said, "Come down and save our friends here." But not one man died of that expedition. They all lived. Nobody
I wasn't aware of that. That's a good factoid.
That is why what's incredible, Shackleton was famous as an Arctic explorer. He did not want to lose any lives. And I think he died of a heart attack like a couple of years later. He was getting ready to do another expedition, and he had a massive coronary and died. But a fascinating story. And of course, they had been missing for almost 2 years at that point. And when he walked into this whaling station and they saw him, and of course they were in terrible shape, these guys, they were like in shock. Oh my God, Shackleton, look at you. Where did you come from? You're lost. You're gone. You go down into the Antarctic and they don't see you for 2 years. You're assumed dead.
Oh, absolutely. Even in modern day. Are you kidding me? Today. The research is called off. We couldn't find them, and then you found your way into an ice cave and then pop out because you were eating algae out of the ice or something, right?
Right. Yeah, it's an incredible story. But here we're seeing these incredible temperatures. These are, when you read Admiral Byrd's book, I don't remember him recording a negative 68 that winter he spent, the first human being to spend a winter in Antarctica. I don't remember that. I mean, I have to go back. Maybe he did, but I don't think so. And didn't we get a record temperature in Antarctica recently? I thought I read negative 78. Wasn't that the coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth?
It was touching that. I think the coldest is 82 below zero or 81 below zero dot something. But the reason that was such a thing is, down at that time of the year, again, it was an out of season thing. It was in the wrong month for that extreme cold to happen. But, the reason that it came to a lot of attention was that was literally within a degree or so of the coldest temperature ever recorded on the entire planet in the warmest year ever, going into spring in the warmest year ever. So that didn't sink too well over there, did it? That was last year, by the way. That was
last year. Yeah. This record temperature grip Siberia. They've got a quote from two scientists. One, Dr. Fred Seitz, said, "I have never before witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report." And Dr. Tom Sagelstad says the IPCC global warming model is not supported by the scientific data.
How many times, again, that kind of brings us full circle. How many times have their predictions fallen off? And then why is the global temperature down under 1/10 of a degree, under that mark, 0.00 or 0.08 against the 30-year baseline average? And they're trying to sell you all these carbon taxes, the Great Reset, and everything that's structured to move your life is based on humans are committing and emitting too much carbon, committing too many offenses by buying things. Oh, but the advertisements tell you buy two. The same corporations say buy three. The two are on sale are the same ones that are out there going, oh, there's too much CO2. And how many times can you see the predictions fall through before? I guess never, because so many people are still on the bandwagon of believing. But you need to be a little bit older to understand the changed predictions, and especially that 1.5 C now. We got to keep carbon dioxide below 1.5 C, because you got to realize even when it terminates at its point, it'll still last 1,000 years in the atmosphere. Methane will come banging out of there about 7 years after, 7 to 10 years, once it reaches that point. Like that methane actually disappears and dissipates.
We're not living in a time where the largest amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, are we?
No, you'd have to go back. I mean, how long do you want to talk about further into the past? So
let's go 20,000 years. What was it like then?
150 years, but why don't we go back 10 million years, 100 million years, 30,000 years, 12,000 years at the Younger Dryas, when whatever impact event happened, the Earth's temperature dropped 15 degrees Celsius in a matter of a year, or maybe even months, but then it rebounded out as quickly. The Earth's temperature, for those of you who want to check, rose 15 degrees Celsius in 3 years. Now that was at the end of the Younger Dryas, circa 12,000 years ago. Now the conjecture is a comet or a fragment of a comet came in and hit the Laurentide ice sheet over Canada, hit it, exploded. So imagine a comet hitting an ice sheet during the coming out of the ice age. What would happen? Huge amount of steam. The Carolina bays, which have all these indentations, supposedly where it hit and where those giant ice fragments rolled up through the atmosphere, 40, 50 miles. And when they came down as tonnage, as pieces of ice smashed into there, that's why they can find no impactors. But all those Carolina bays created with the same trajectory as the ice came over, of course, it's going to have a pattern going out wherever the shock wave would move forward, and they're all facing the same direction, so they can kind of even triangulate now where it hit, what angle it hit at, and then where did all the debris fly out and create these patterns across the planet that are supposedly unexplainable.
And the debris can also blot out the sunlight, can prevent the sunlight from heating the Earth, so it contributes to this effect, as well as the heat from the blast melting ice and melting ocean and whatever, and creating clouds, more water vapor, which also is going to cool the Earth.
Yeah, not to mention the cold water that would have spilled into the oceans that had an equalized warm temperature. Because imagine if a quarter of an entire ice sheet on a continent melts in the same one day, and it's flowing in 1,000, 2,000 foot floods toward the ocean, sculpting a lot of places in Washington State and Oregon. Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have done an enormous amount of work on this, where the floods had actually terminated out. And these floods, were 2,000, 3,000 feet deep. But how much cold water would have gone into the ocean and then upset everything? Because you have to think about, in an ice age, and so many people don't understand that when the ice age climate locks in, it locks in for 60,000 years of the exact same plant and harvest dates. The oceans would have stabilized temperature. Everything would have locked in. Like we know in at least our interglacial period here, there's a planting and a harvesting date because our weather was stable enough for us to plan that. Well, it's gone out of sync now. That's why we're having problems with food production globally. But if you had a full-on ice age that had locked in and they had stable growing for, let's say, even 20,000 years, 30,000 years, what kind of societies could have arisen about that? But how quickly would it terminate when you disrupted that entire system with water flows that are, these things are so unimaginable for us to comprehend on the size of it, on the planetary scale of it. But there was an impact event that did things so many orders of magnitude. So when they look back in history, and I'm sorry, Jeff, I'm going to ramble for a second here.
Yeah.
That Younger Dryas period is always the cutoff point when they show you these temperature maps and all these things. They always leave that point out of there. They always start the temperature 8,000 years ago, 9,000, but they never go back to 13,000 years ago and show you that gigantic drop and the gigantic rise, and then we were. And they keep telling you of all time, it's never been. Well, wait a second, just go back 12,000 years, and yes, it has been, but like orders of magnitude more than it is today. So this whole warmest ever, I don't know, again, what are the time frames they're talking? The last interglacial, that was warmer than now. And that was 118,000 years ago. It was a degree Celsius average global temperature warmer than now. So their whole, it's the warmest ever in the last how many, millions of years, blah. Go out and do some
we go back 1,000 years and it was warmer than it is now.
Yeah, that's true.
The medieval warming period, you had
how did
they were
Europe
growing
respond to
crops.
that? Is the question.
They were growing crops in Greenland, which they can't grow now because the ground is frozen year round in Greenland. And they called it Greenland for a reason, because it was green then. So, and people go, how could they call it Greenland? It's all just white. It's all permanently frozen all year round. It wasn't then. When the Vikings first came to Greenland, they did farming. Well, nobody can farm in Greenland now. And they wanted, that was that whole scandal. That whole, they got rid of the hockey stick. They got rid of the, that warming period in their data. They just took it, right. They took it right out of the data. That's gaslighting everybody. This is science now, ladies and gentlemen, where you actually falsify your data. Is this getting more familiar now? We're seeing this all the time. It's like science is, we say it's science, but you're lying. Those aren't the numbers. Here we have this next article here. Low temperature records continue to fall across Europe. Australia's New South Wales suffers coldest November on record. And this is December 1st, 2021.
Chapters of history are written by how cold it is or how much food you can grow or not. And that is the last 10,000 years of Earth's recorded history, and what we know civilization is determined by how much food you can grow, period. And when you start to see all these signs lining up from both hemispheres now, that below normal temperatures are there, I think the southern hemisphere is leading this grand solar minimum by one season, and then like what they just experienced down there, we'll experience here, and vice versa. There'll be one season ahead as it goes into winter next year. But just look at the rise and fall of civilizations, even over the last 4,000 years. Well, why did they get to this apex point and then they crash with the highest science, mathematics, etc., and then boom, they're down again? So it has to be something that triggers that event, and it's always the lack of food that can be produced. So we're just looking at chapters history driven by the sun.
Yeah, and of course we have unprecedented numbers of people on the world. If we go back through written history, we're talking about 2,500 years of written history going back to Herodotus, in which the population of the world was probably a couple 100 to 300 million people total. You get to about 200 years ago, you got about 1 billion people maybe. So now all of a sudden, in the last 50 years, we go from about 3 billion people, 2.5 to 3 billion people. Already we're almost at 8 billion people in the world at this time. And that is astonishing. So if we've doubled the world population in the last 35 years, nearly 8 billion, last 40 years, we're suddenly, we've been able to feed those people because it's warmer on the planet. And because it's warmer on the planet, but now it's getting colder, what's going to happen? And we see the effects on food growing, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But here we have this article, record lows grip Europe. Sweden registers minus 37.4 degrees centigrade. That's 35.3 degrees Fahrenheit. UK schools forced to shut, bigger freeze inbound. And this is November 30th, just a few days ago now. And there's a clear-cut solar climate coupling and very strong natural variability of climate on all historical timescales. I can hardly believe anymore that there's any relevant relationship between human CO2 emissions and climate change. This is from, I don't know how to say his name. His name is Smith, Heyo Smith. But this is very, very interesting. And with these negative 35.3 degrees Sweden.
Yeah, how do you explain that? That's some of the coldest temperatures they've ever had. And this November was the coldest November they've ever had.
Brutal Arctic
negative 37, that broke all their temperature records. Even in the month of December, you're looking at the onset of the cold events, and you can trace that month by month on what the coldest month is, obviously January, February. But they're getting those temperatures now, which is so, everything seems to be getting cooler months in advance. And then last year we lost our wine vines because, we just planted them. And then it got so cold later in the spring after planting that everything was frozen. So the cold's onsetting earlier, and it's having strange freeze events further into the spring after people plant. And this is the exact same thing talked through history. The loss of crops coming into harvest season, and then into the spring, the planting season was delayed by months, plural. And they didn't have the machines back then that we do.
And here we were talking about sea ice. Here's another item. Arctic sea ice extent currently second highest in 15 years and growing. Wow.
That's how did that ever happen? IPCC. Does anybody ever want to correct it? All those news headlines that you say, some of them are being memory hold. The good ones, like the Arctic temperatures you mentioned, you couldn't find it. You had to go in the Wayback Machine and look for it. But where are these retractions or additions to? Okay, the sea ice, I had a chance to look through the 2021 IPCC report for policymakers, and that's a real easy one to read. They're not going to give you the full 300-page thing. But in there, it's 20 pages, 20 plus pages, and one of the sea ice graphs were in there, and they were off on the miss on last year and this year, but the projections were so far getting low that the actual sea ice amount was literally from here to my microphone on their chart, and there was no retraction or addendum to say, well, sea ice has been accumulating and growing over the last years. In Greenland, another anomaly, how much record ice is on Greenland up there, because on the electroverse chart you can jump over to the DMI, which is the Danish Meteorological Institute, and then you can check out the Greenland ice daily, which is either gains or losses, accumulated balance. There's a whole bunch of different variants in there to see what the ice is doing on Greenland. Well, they had an event last year that took it two orders of scale off the chart, 13 gigatons for a single day gain, and they have their chart pegged at 10. So they'd have to put a whole nother thing, and then that blue line would stick up in last year, so it wouldn't make sense. Like, wait, we're supposed to be losing ice, and if you look at the overall gains on Greenland, they continue to rebound and have extreme anomalies with these massive gains. If you look at the sea ice or the Greenland ice chart from last year, there were two massive events that were so far out that they literally need to redo the chart to add two new bands in at the top there so it can fit from last year's gains.
What I've noticed is that through all this is when I go to look, I know something, I've seen something go by about colder weather, and I go back to find it, and I can't find it with a Google search. It's like the search engines, and then all I can find about it is how it's getting warmer and how these idiots these climate deniers are all wrong. And it's like, why is there accuracy to make us believe it's getting warmer when it's actually getting colder? What's that about? We've got a story here. Rare heavy November snow traps Brits in pub. I guess they might like that, right? To get trapped in a pub for third night as Arctic blast across Europe. Yeah. That's where to get stuck if you're going to be stuck.
Oh, the keg's dry. No.
And they quote Professor Fritz Verenholt, quote, "It's now obvious that the IPCC models are not correctly reflecting the development of atmospheric temperatures." Of course, they're trapped in a pub for 3 days by snow in the UK. When does that happen?
15-foot snow drifts too. Don't forget that part.
They were. I saw that they had the picture there. If the readers go and find that story, there it is. This is the pub. Is just the whole building's covered in snow.
And did you see the blizzard warning for Hawaii as well?
No, there's a blizzard warning for Hawaii.
Yeah, Big Island.
The Big
Island. Don't worry
about
it. Don't ask any questions.
they've got
No,
high
I'm
altitude
totally
there.
serious today. If you look,
Yes.
there's a blizzard warning for Hawaii today on December 3rd.
And then, of course, in Scotland, Nordic power prices surge on sub-zero temps and low winds. Danger to life warning issued in Scotland, plus no hurricanes for the first time in 65 years. This is from November 26th.
Well, you're looking at a changing ocean, which also drives a lot of different weather patterns that are hitting Europe coming off of those isles first. So when you look back in history, you start to see when there's different circulation changes in the ocean, the upwelling, the sinking of the cooler waters, if that gets disturbed at all, well, then that warm water patch that's there that keeps the UK would probably be about the same temperature as Moscow. I think I've heard this reference before. London would be about the same temperature as Moscow if that ocean current didn't circulate up there to allow different weather patterns and a warming ocean to keep that climate, substantially.
Yeah, I know that if Moscow was in the Western Hemisphere here in North America, it would be on Hudson's Bay. That's how far north it is. I know that Europe is further north than most of North America, but it's got, as you say, the warming current. I have a friend in Sweden, and I'll call him here from the northern upper Midwest. Actually, more Canadians live south of where I am than live north of where I am right now, because part of America sticks above, Ontario, where a lot of Canadians live. But you think about how further north Hudson's Bay is from where I am. It's like, ugh, that's really scary. But the current does change the weather and make it possible for people to be in places. And to make sure it's not a fluke, here we've got a story. Historic snow hits Japan. Record flurries cause shutdowns in Russia and China. Spain issues cold weather alerts, restarts old coal power plants to cope. This is from November 25th.
Yeah, the snow flurries in Beijing were a full-on blizzard with multiple feet of snow and also 10-foot snow drifts, and that was the second snowfall of the year. The first one was what you referenced. They had flurries come down, and not more than a week later, they had one of the biggest blizzards and the earliest ever recorded there. And that Japan snowfall was from record sea effect.
Wow.
Japan has something called sea effect snow, where that area in the Yellow Sea there stays a bit warmer.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, because Japan,
really Arctic cold front, they dropped massive amounts of snow over Sapporo.
It's incredible.
Snow. And then last year, it happened the same, but it was in a different month. It was in January, and they got something like 4 feet of snow. Same, it was a record sea effect snow, but in a different month, just a year later. So it came earlier this year than January of last year.
Yeah, and of course, then they've got this is from November 24th, new peer-reviewed study, climate models overestimate CO2's impact on global temperatures by a factor of 5. So yeah, that is, if you have 5, they're making it into 25, and that's really it. And of course, school canceled in Yakutia, Russia, as temperatures plunged to negative 50 degrees centigrade. That's 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Rare late snows hit Argentina. Parts of Antarctica are holding unusually cold. That's what we were talking about earlier, from November 23rd. So, I mean, we're getting it all over the planet. There's almost nobody is escaping this.
Yeah, and the power prices too. You mentioned the prices going up 5x up there in the Scandinavian countries. Well, if you go to Singapore, right off of Zero Hedge today, I was reading that the prices for electricity in Singapore had gone up 12x, 1,290%, almost 13x.
Right.
Can you imagine that the average household? So think about it, and the reason I bring that up is the food prices are going to go up exponentially too. And this is another thing in history. The economy struggles because so much money of disposable economy gets put into food. And then at some point, that's 100% of earnings go to buy the daily food. That's it. There's nothing left. But then, you're looking at a 12x increase in electrical prices, and I'm sure the food prices in Singapore are going up too. So at what point can a society not cope? And at what point do they go to the streets because they can't cope? And this is another fingerprint of the grand solar minimums. There's always change of government during these events. So it's pretty much, you see the indicators, what we've been talking about here, these events on the weather, these are all the indicators. It's here, it's in play. You can't really dispute it anymore. What was forecast is now here. Now let's look back in history and see how it's going to play out across the landscape. with the rising food prices, rising electrical prices. I would say population migration, which has always happened, but it's not because we're all locked down because of the COVID. Like very few people can go to another place now. It's almost nigh impossible too. And before, through history, if there were no, we continued the way we did in 2018, I would say 1 billion people would have moved from where they are now, from whatever they're experiencing. But then the governments can't cope either, and they always collapse and get restructured. There's new forms of farming and overseeance and thumb screwing across nations for the next, how do you top-down control a society? But the previous top-down control for society always dissolves. So how many of these are we seeing going at the moment? And then what's the forecast moving out as to how fast this will happen? Because if you're looking at increasing power prices across the planet and food prices doubling or tripling next year, at what point do they start to put military in the store because of the shoplifting? And we're seeing these smash and grab shoplift stuff. I think that is just the base. It's already planned. They're going to hit supermarkets next, which is then a reason to put troops and police in there in the supermarkets. They'll start with the high-end stuff. Nobody cares anymore. But then your access to the food, they're going to really need to control who gets the food, and it'll be rationing and how much. All right, that's the base layer of what will happen in 2022 and 3. But people are going to get really angry when they can't get their food. And if you ration to 1 loaf of bread per family.
Yeah, let's talk about the fertilizer because people don't quite understand modern farming. It used to be you would have to farm these acres and let these acres rest and replenish, and you have rotating farming, and you'd have to replenish the soil. We've pretty much, with the massive farming we're doing to feed almost 8 billion people, we're exhausting the soil everywhere, aren't we?
Well, you could put an ED on that because a lot of places it's so exhausted that you literally couldn't grow anything without the fertilizer.
Without the fertilizer.
So you have the medium substrate of the dirt, but there's nothing in it, zero. The only thing that goes in it is the fertilizer you put on it.
The soil's exhausted. We need the fertilizer. Why is there a fertilizer shortage?
The story is bottlenecks in CO2 production and the ammonia plant going down in Louisiana after the hurricane. Chemicals to be able to create the fertilizer.
And Russia's not exporting either, are they?
Mm-mm.
So now that's interesting. Now we happened upon this little gem. Russia and China know that the world is cooling, not warming. Their scientists know that this is happening. I've seen it. I've watched their press. They give lip service, but you probably saw the interview several years ago when the whole scandal happened about them in Britain, where they got rid of that medieval warming period, and they kind of got caught at that, and somebody asked Putin in a press conference about it, and he said, "Oh, I don't believe in global warming. I believe in global cooling," and he kind of had that little smile on his face he sometimes has. And of course, he's given lip service to global warming since then, but I know pretty much from being a Putin follower that he doesn't believe in it. And I don't think the Chinese do either. And I think that knowing that food shortages are coming, that the normal food growing areas in the north are going to be less productive, let's say, that they are starting to build greenhouses and conserve water out in the deserts of Central Asia, where China and Russia own a lot of territory in a more southerly area in Asia, below Siberia, below some of these northern areas. Are they now sucking in that fertilizer because they realize they have to make the desert bloom to survive?
That's what I would do. Now it's about actions that you see other governments making, because China put that social credit score in and really started ramping it up about 5 years ago. Well, that's the right time. The same time that this grand solar minimum was being more confirmed each year with the solar cycle and the activity and these anomalous weather events that it was in place. So China was already setting the base to control food distribution, which they're already control it right now. So at what point, do we come behind that? And
so if your social credit score falls too low in a few years, they'll just turn you into Soylent Green, right?
Or you'll be denied. Let's say there's different ranges of bread. Okay, you have a handmade artesian loaf with olives baked in on it. All right, that's on the top shelf if you get your social credit score above 810. If you got a bad social credit score, you're eating white Wonder Bread at the bottom. They could differentiate what kind or how much.
Mm-hmm. Or you can be the one who's the meal, right?
Yeah, in a bizarro world, and I hope it doesn't come to that.
I
But
mean,
just to go back to Central Asia here for a second, the aquifers that they're talking about tapping from Kyrgyzstan,
mhm.
Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan,
Now, is there
411,000 cubic kilometers of water reside under those areas.
really, that's that much water's under there?
That's how much water is trapped under there. So when you start to see these transboundary or aquifers is what they call them, where it overlaps on two countries in both. Kyrgyzstan is now trading a dam and a reservoir over to Uzbekistan to get access to be able to, drill wells and tap into that boundary area of where the aquifer terminates.
Hmm.
Because it terminates in the area where everything is drained to. So that if you're looking at primary water sources, now across the planet, there's something called primary water, where it's the main trunk line, for a better term, that feeds all the other wells within a regional area. So if you can tap into that main point where everything, so let's say like a bunch of mountain ranges push all the water into a lake, and then from that lake, then it dissipates out and refills all the aquifers, even the ones 50 or 100 miles away, 200 miles away, it all stems back from that lake refilling. You would want to start putting your wells right around there because it would be continuous. You'd never run out, ever. It's a primary water source. And there's 3 times more water in the Earth's crust than there is on the surface of all the oceans, rivers, lakes. So think about that. If you knew where the pressure was coming up from in the crust, refilling those same aquifers from beneath versus above, or a combination of both.
And we're talking about fresh water. We're talking about drinkable water, usable water.
Yeah, we're talking about usable drinkable water for agriculture with no filtration because it's coming straight from the earth. Now, if there's more calcium in it or something that could affect plant growth, yeah, you could mediate that or mitigate that. But the way they're looking at it now is the earth has all the water under it. We've squandered and polluted all the water on the top. So why not go into it now? Because I think that's why all these agreements are being made in warmer climates and all this amount of how many millions of greenhouses are being put out in these areas. They're tapping the desert. Same with the Nubian sandstone aquifer in the Sahel. If you're going to put up a new grow zone in Africa, the West African monsoon's increasing rainfall with this change into the grand solar minimum the next couple hundred years, as well as there's much far larger amount in the aquifers under the Sahel and all of northern Africa. But I was just talking about the Libyan area there where Gaddafi had put out an enormous amount of agriculture, tapping that very same water source, built all these gigantic aqueducts and giant pipe systems to bring water from under the desert underneath it up and out to irrigate crops. And they were a couple 100,000 acres into production before it got all destroyed by the U.S. Somebody's going that same play, 2.0. Proof of concept was Libya. Now it's being really put out in play in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Central Asia.
So we're seeing the Russian-dominated Central Asia, where China and Russia come together. We're seeing that being developed. Is there any sign that the Western countries are preparing, that America is preparing? Are we getting ready for this? Are we just so diluted by global warming that we think we're going to be growing? The Amazon's coming to Alaska. I mean, is there any realism here at all?
No, it's cartoon land, actually. Because the way the United States and a lot of the countries are going into it to limit your access to food, they're going to do all these hoops and hurdles where you're going to need to take the next round into the body to keep the green pass going. And if you don't have that, you won't have any access to the food. Because look how fast everything has moved, even in the last 2 months. In the mandatory across how many countries now? 3?
Now they've got
maybe more.
Vaccine, they got a mandate in Austria, and of course we know what's happening in Australia.
And Germany's on the bench to do that next, and then you go to Lithuania, I think also.
It seems to be about, locking people down and getting them to get a passport, which is going to be like one of these cards you're talking about where you've got a social credit score and whatnot.
For what reason? See, the reason is control of food and access to food. I'm sure of it now. So give me a reason why you would need all this to control what and access to what.
You're controlling the food. Yeah. See, the more and more I come back to this grand solar minimum is maybe the key to understanding all kinds of things that have been put into motion, all kinds of things that are happening around the world. And when you see countries like when you see what Moscow and Beijing are doing, and what you see how the West is being gaslit, you're saying, okay, who is managing this process? To whose advantage is it? To what extent are we being herded like sheep? Reality is a little different than we're being told, right? We're going into a very dangerous, possibly a mini ice age. We got 8 billion people on the planet, and we're going to have 4 or 5 billion of them without enough food to eat. Would that be about accurate? And somebody knows it. Somebody knows that's coming.
Yeah, it
And
would
they're
be. And
trying to set up the machinery to manage this, right?
right. And the higher echelons of power surely know what's going on. And the way it's been described or explained to me is that they're trying to save the most amount of people they can and still carry through some semblance of a society to still retain power on the other side with whatever is set up during this transition period.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, coming back to what we consider infrastructure, it's not going to work. So there'll be a lot of breakdowns and unexplained incidences of things breaking, snapping, and it just doesn't make sense why that route is suddenly closed. They're talking about, if you can't get to the banks or you're going to use satellite uplinks and then broadcast your central bank digital currencies or, crypto that you have. So that's just like for a real simple example. Thinking about using the terrestrial internet to broadcast transactions might not work because if fiber optic cables are snapping and there's electrical outages, etc. If you had your home point and everybody had a satellite dish and everybody had a solar panel or whatever device, battery backup that would power that, you would be able to transmit up into a satellite network. Because Chinese quantum system was way back, 2015 or so, to do the same thing with cryptocurrency transactions. And that was the whole, wow. Even if you had a full-on power grid down and you had a internet connection up to satellites, like Starlink's a famous one now that's they're not really ready yet, but envision that, or the quantum satellite network up there put up by China, you could broadcast cryptocurrency transactions directly from your base station. That's all renewable powered, solar panels, etc., up to the satellite, and that would then broadcast it down into the next place where it needed to verify whatever it needs to be verified. And that could be something encrypted, it could be a cryptocurrency transaction, it could be a simple wire transfer, through the SWIFT system, whatever it is. And that's the way we're going to work around at least some of these what's considered simple power outages and cable breakages. So, that's an example. So somebody's planning for this already, but the human element, how are you going to pull 8 billion people to the next side? You're not. It's simply not going to happen. So there's going to be damage along the way. They're willing to take the loss. They're going to try to pull some or as many people they can. Well, I don't know exactly the number chosen to the other side of this chaos, unless you're self-sufficient, and then you can do it yourself. But once you get on the other side, let's say these self-sufficient communities rock on and they're way more bountiful and more people want to stay there, and then you pull to the other side, and then suddenly you got the control grid back, and then the governments are going to be like, wait a second, y'all can't be that. So you have to be on our system again. What push and pull is that going to come to? If the communities get really self-sufficient over the next decade or so to the point where they're autonomous, but then governments will be functional in 2032, 2033 again, because everything will stabilize. This is only a 10, 12-year event. Everything's going to stabilize mid-2030s. Then what? The government's going to be back in, and they're going to want full control again. But wait a second, this entire section of society split off over here, totally self-sufficient, and doesn't want to go back on that grid at all. So then where's the push and pull going to be around 2035 when governments are going to struggle to get that whole round of people back in under their control once more?
I was wondering to ask your opinion of something. You've heard about, Professor Hapgood supposedly working with Einstein about this.
And the CIA.
And the CIA with some kind of discovery they made decades ago about a periodic catastrophe related to pole shift, related to the Earth's electromagnetic field, going away and then reversing and recharging. Something happens then. And they've been keeping it secret, haven't they? And
that's the Adam and Eve story.
Right, the Adam and Eve story. And I I know, Hapgood's famous for the maps of the ancient sea kings. Very unusual book. If anybody gets a chance, it shows that they had these maps in ancient Alexandria back in way, way, way back in the before Julius Caesar, and these maps were copied from copies and copies of copies. And when the Turks sacked Constantinople in the 15th century, these maps were captured by the Turks. And in the 1920s, a U.S. naval officer was given these maps from a Turkish, I think it was a Turkish naval officer, Reese maps, they call them. And Hapgood published them in the maps of the ancient sea kings. And these maps are unusual because they show the coast of Antarctica ice free. And the maps are accurate. And the maps are very, very old. These are pre-Columbian maps, before Columbus. Antarctica wasn't discovered until the early 19th century. They didn't even know it was there, and so this is very intriguing. And they made, do you know what was it that they discovered that they're keeping secret? Do you have any idea what it is?
Well, let me add in another, fact into the Hapgood story, and then maybe we can come to an answer after that.
Okay.
So Charles Hapgood is also credited with discovering or putting a mechanism to what's called Earth's crustal displacement.
Yes.
Where the Earth will literally roll over on itself. So with those two pieces in mind, they couldn't explain how Antarctica got suddenly flipped from being tropics with ferns and the fossils down there in the coal beds, etc., being turned all the way down to the bottom of the planet. But he had all the ancient sea maps understanding that. So now they were trying to put a mechanism with why Antarctica was down there, why these maps were there. And then he came up with the same idea that there is at some point a 0 point. And I'm not talking about David LaPointe's 0 point. I'm talking about they're just saying the magnetic field went to zero or near zero, both on the sun and on the Earth. And our Earth was able to spin and maybe do a quarter turn, like the 23 degrees. And then when the magnetic fields relocked themselves, they did. But our Earth has not always been at this tilt on
In
the
fact,
ecliptic. And they were trying to explain that all the way. So I don't know what's the hidden part there.
They found tropical corals underneath the ice of the Arctic, right? I mean, that's my understanding. I think
it means it happens on a cycle and it's going in different directions each time. So a quarter turn that way, quarter turn that. Oh, that would explain the Arctic sea corals. Okay, that's 2 cycles ago.
Right.
But then you try to put a timeline on the cycle length, and this is where you get into the problem.
Yeah,
or the hidden part.
And to explain it to the listeners, Hapgood got his inspiration, I think, by watching a washing machine get out of balance. And I think all of us who have done laundry, you put too much and you put your lumpy laundry in the laundry, and it spins like the Earth spins. You got the your laundry washing machine, it goes around, and when it goes in the dry cycle, it spins around really fast. And if that load is out of balance, you can watch your washing machine literally jumping up and down and banging and booming and just completely going into convulsions because it's out of balance and it's just going haywire. So Hapgood thought, wait a minute, the Earth has a wobble. What if the Earth gets out of balance periodically and does this kind of washing machine kind of thing, right? And does that centrifugal force start to move the Earth's crust, start to tear and to move, right? Is that basically the idea?
Yeah, it's like having an orange, and then on the inside you separate the orange from the peel on the outside, and those two could rotate independently. But I don't care how heavy it gets with the ice on the top or the bottom or the center or wherever it is, you need lack of magnetic field to turn the planet over in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. So basically the planet becomes loosey-goosey when this electromagnetic field that coheres it kind of loosens up, and then awful things can happen.
Doesn't loosen up, it goes to zero, and that's how that affected it. The only possible time it is if it's a zero magnetic field where there's no orientation of north and south. So the center part of the planet has no orientation to lock anything in. They're both sliding with zero magnetic pointing in any direction. And then suddenly when the magnetic field starts again, even that 1/10,000th or 1/1,000,000th of a second, it locks back into exactly where they're oriented. And then it'll reposition itself north-south. But at that moment, wherever the Earth's crust sits, it relocks. And wherever the center might be or transiting over that, the mantle, it locks too. Because you look at the crust, it's a different charge. Even the atmosphere is a different charge than the crust. So we just
We
got this
don't,
middle boundary layer of different charge between atmosphere, mantle, and then connection back to the
and
sun.
and and we don't know the physics of the universe. We just got theories. What is the electric universe theory? Do you know that at all?
There are currents moving through the spiral arm of the galaxy from the core of our galaxy itself.
Mm-hmm.
And they're more like high tension lines, if you will, in the space around us. And it's an electrified plasma. They're called Birkeland currents. There are two charges on that wind between themselves, and that's why they get the ropes or the auroral ropes. There's been a couple articles coming out just recently talking about how the Earth's sandwiched inside and encompassed in a magnetic field. They were explaining the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine one, like I'll go back to the coffee shop example, if you put more charge or more current into that, it's going to make something glow more highly. Okay, our sun is sitting in one of these Birkeland currents in our local star system. So the charge from elsewhere, the other end of our spiral arm of our galaxy, the center of the galaxy, whatever, has turned down that charge. And it seems to be an electrical frequency with a predictability in the cycle. And when that steps down, our sun responds to that. It steps down too.
So it
And when
affects.
it gets more highly charged, our sun steps up and has different effects, locking our jet streams in pattern and the cloud cells.
I see. So it could affect a whole bunch of stars at the same time.
Yeah, they've seen entire star fields have anomalies either disappear or all start glowing red, which is an indication of all of them novaing at the same time.
Really?
That's just within what we can see right now. A couple years ago, there was an article, more than 1,000 stars just disappeared.
Wow.
But they didn't disappear. See, they didn't disappear. The current flowing into them turned down, so they came out of visible glow mode of what we can perceive with our eyes and came out of the visible spectrum range.
Yeah, okay.
That's how they stopped glowing, is the current got turned down so they didn't glow as brightly.
So you think that the evidence for this electric universe model, there is evidence for it?
There is, because when you look at Earth's temperature and climate over 12,000, 100,000, even going back to the ice ages, it's a pulse. It almost looks like a heartbeat. It's very electrical.
Oh, yes,
when you look at all these different charts going back in the past, especially the longer ones, the million-year charts that are broken down, look at about every 100,000 years, you see a pulse. It's like a heartbeat. Doom, doom. Because the Earth spends 90,000 of those years in ice state. These 10,000 years, they might make you think like it says all the time, but it's not. It's very rare. We get 10,000 years of warmth and 90,000 years of ice. Ice is the normal state of this planet. Only 10% of the entire time are we at this warmth level.
Yeah,
how can you explain that coming into the ice ages and exiting the ice ages? You can't tell me every single time it's a comet hitting something to create magma that blows out and suddenly it gets hotter, or something hit the sun and we get these things on this exact frequency of 100,000 years. That's not possible. Not possible.
Yeah, of course, we've been in a kind of ice age for 2 million years now. Basically,
look at the frequency of that, though. When you look at those ice age charts, it looks exactly like you've seen EKG in a hospital.
Yeah, for 2 million years.
It's just a coincidence, though. That's just coincidence.
It's just a coincidence, yeah. So the real thing to fear is global cooling and ice, basically.
No, the fear is not being able to respond quickly enough, and governments not even wanting to have the conversations, and not wanting to respond, and not getting the citizens to respond. We can adjust to the temperature changes. We can adjust our food growing latitudes. We can substitute crops. There's an enormous amount of things. Vertical indoor ag. We can take all these malls and parking garages that are not used anymore, wink, wink, and suddenly turn those into indoor agriculture centers and create jobs and do all these things. But it's the response that's the scary part. We can respond to it, but the governments do not want or are not letting, and they're distracting with so many other things when we could be coming at solutions for this. But again, probably doesn't want everybody to move into the next world. So the solutions are not forthcoming. And, conversations like this are not promoted and pushed in algorithms because it goes against the science of things getting, warmer, colder, I don't know what it is anymore.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that our institutions are failing us right now. It's a complicated subject in itself, why our institutions are failing. And is there anything else we need to cover that you can think of that we have missed here in trying to update people on this story of global cooling and where we're headed?
Well, just understanding the fertilizer, not going to, it's still going to be available, but CF Industries was saying at the wholesale level, we're talking buying 1 million tons forward or whatnot. You're going to be seeing a 45% increase in the price. Now, by the time it goes to the next distribution point and then it comes out to your local co-op or you get it in, Home Depot or whenever it gets there, it's going to be at least double or triple the price.
I talk to farmers
if
up
you can
here.
Get it.
Yeah, I have a friend who is a farmer, and he's talking about fertilizer prices doubling or tripling.
But the yields are going to go down 20%. And that's what not a lot of people are talking about. And if anybody's been following the Sri Lanka mayhem down there, see, Sri Lanka was being so woke, and they said, oh, no more chemical fertilizers in Sri Lanka this year. So they cut off all chemical fertilizers coming in, only organics or what you made. So they set up all these village co-op programs where one village would make organic fertilizer for all the farmers around that area. But even doing that, their yields were down 50%. So then they had to save the day by bringing back chemicals to boost them, mostly potash, to kick everything into high gear for the last month and a half of maturation. But just generally across the globe, if you think we're going to go with the fertilizer production this year, we're going to get 10, I'll just be conservative and say 10% decline globally across all the grains that we grow, or any agribusiness that uses an enormous amount of fertilizer as the input to get things to grow. Now, I think it's going to be closer to 20 myself, so a lot of reports I'm reading is 20, but I'll be conservative and say 10% decline globally. What's that going to do for the prices? And look how much business there's not happening now. It's almost as if this hole in the door is being pushed on purpose. The rising prices, the hyperinflation, access points to food, higher food prices, inavailability of foods, the rationing, and the whole thing is the human impact. How are they going to react to this? Well, you already know how they're going to react. They're going to be angry. They're going to the streets. They're going to want change. And you know what? Boom, there's already a solution. The assets have already been pre-positioned for the army and the military to roll in and control all food and your life. I mean, they're going to try to control it super hard. I mean, you think it's been kind of going, there's a lot of adjectives we could use, the direction that the world's being pushed and the freedoms that are being lost. There's an enormous amount of adjectives to put in there. But I'm going to say this next 2022 and 23 are going to be hard pipe hitting years for these police and military to come in. They've been nice until now, but when it starts in the middle of 22 next year, they're not going to be nice. You're going to need to get in front of that. Learn how to grow food, buy some food, stock some food, get your communities ready, because the amount of change we're going to see is going to be a once in a 2,000-year event of change happening in 3 years here. Exponentially coming in.
So
it's
all like when you talk to Valentina Zarkova, you hear this thing that it is going to be in the next 2-3 years we're going to see this change, and they're not going to be able to maintain the global warming narrative much longer, are they?
No, they're going to be worried about maintaining food prices and preventing riots from overthrowing governments every day. That's going to be the new thing. Forget the global warming. How governments are going to respond to retain their power when hundreds of millions, if not billions of people go onto the streets because of this food crisis globally.
Well, I would suggest that the people that have been telling us it's been getting warmer are going to get overthrown, because everyone's going to say, you lied to us. You said it was getting warmer, and that would be good for growing food, but it's getting colder, and you knew, right? Isn't that what's going to happen?
Well, that's one way to look at it, is pointing the finger, blaming everybody. We're past that. It's action time. See, governments should be stepping up this very second, and on the next hour's newsfeed, we should be seeing solutions for growing, explaining what the problem is, explaining where we need to go, and how we can each take action in our communities based on the latitude you live. Like, there should be daily reports of what species can grow in your latitude, how much rainfall there is, what kind of government subsidies could there be for water and fertilizer, putting out a greenhouse, they're paying you to put solar panels. Why aren't we all being paid to put greenhouses out? And why aren't we being paid to put barns and raise our own chicken and get all these things into, not me raising 7 chickens and 9 ducks or something, but having an area for the community to do it, and everything being pushed for our own food self-sufficiency, but none of that is forthcoming. None of it.
No, it's not happening. No.
No, there's not. So I just look at this and say, well, this is the turning point. Since nothing's been done to this point, then you're going to have to take action on your own because nobody's coming to help you. If a seal pops out of the ice, or you take the, you know what I mean? It's going to be like that for 2 to 3 years on the planet, the whole planet. Which is interesting, talking about Shackleton. Yeah, it's a global Shackleton event.
Yeah. We're going to all have to learn how to eat penguin, basically, or be Nanook of the North. And let's see, how do you make an igloo? Let's learn. When you realize that people have survived in all kinds of conditions, and they do, you know that some people will adapt and survive and others will not. And it does seem that's where we're headed for sure. Well, very good.
I'm not going to be one of those. And the message I can give out as long as I still have breath is please get ready, because if you're more ready and our communities are more ready, we're all going to get through this way, way, way better. So it's not about me stocking food in my basement and surviving it while you have a terrible time. It's not like that. It's about trying to get as many people on board as you can so everybody can have an easier life moving through this, working together. The more people prepared, the better for me. More people prepared, better for everybody. But thanks, Jeff, for having me on so we can discuss your issues. Hopefully somebody, if even 100 people watch this video and start taking action, this is my hours well spent. Even if one person takes action after watching this video, thank you for spending the time and taking some action after this. It's worth my time to talk. So at least one more person is going to get more ready, and maybe it'll be the butterfly effect or whatever that is, that person will be the person that rolls it over on the planet to help us get ready or go through these changes.